storyboards for movies and whatever they would get. At the time, this is like I started there summer of '74. When I got out of the School of Visual Arts, and so I mean, a lot of people came from there. They had a thing called the Krusty Bunkers, and what would happen is they would get a job to ink, and Neil and Dick would do the main figures, and maybe sometimes Russ Heath, who would work up there a number of times. He'd ink a figure once in a while, and just anybody practically came on the door. Quite you can vouch
Anybody
for.
that walked in the door.
Yeah, I mean, Bernie Wrightson could walk in the door, and he would ink a panel. You'd see him ink either a panel or a figure or something. Hey, here, Bernie, take one. Yeah. So yeah, it was an interesting. It was like in between continuity switches was like in between Marvel and DC. So when Marvel and DC offices closed, everybody, not everybody, but some people converge on continuity. Say, hey, how you doing? So it was a very nice place to work. But yeah, so they would do the main figures, and Bob and I and a lot of other people, Joe Rubenstein, Terry Austin came from there, Pat Broderick, I was just pointing out, and you can mention a few other people. Ralph Reese was working up there at the time too as well, and we would do the backgrounds. We would do the trees, building, the cars, everything else, the splash lines, the asteroids, everything else. So that's how. And if we did it wrong, Neil was ready to say, "That's wrong." Yeah, how to do it better. But Neil was very good. I think also you can vouch for Neil. Neil was very good at. You'd ask him how to do things, and he would actually say to look at other people. He wouldn't directly tell you how to do things. In fact, if you could look over his shoulder and watch him, he didn't mind that either. But Dick Giordano would actually show you. So you had the two ways of learning things. He would actually show you, how things are done. So, but that's how we started the business. Sorry.
I can imagine working that closely with Neil Adams.
No, Neil told you what he, if you were doing a bad job, he'd tell you. But it was good because then you knew that was wrong, and you have to go in another direction how to make it better. Yeah.
So my experience was a little different than Bob's, even though we both worked at continuity. I started out wanting to have my own comic strip, wanting to maybe work for Walt Disney or Mad Magazine. I was much more headed toward being a humor artist, and went to the New York convention the summer of '74, and they had this DC apprenticeship program tryout. And so I tried out for that. I figured I'd just work in comics as like a stepping stone to start my career off, never intending to make a career of comics. And I didn't make it into the apprenticeship program. And I met Pat Broderick at that convention, also applying for that program, and he did get in. And so I went up and met Neil through Pat. Pat introduced me to Neil, and he said, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "Anything that pays," because I was out of money. I had sold my car. I'm from Tampa originally. And I had moved up to New York, sold my car to finance a trip up to New York, and I was down to my last $10. Not getting anywhere, getting rejected from Marvel. The art director at DC, Joe Orlando at the time, actually told me I needed to go back to school and learn how to draw. And I had already been to college and majored in art for a year, and I'd been to art school for a year, and I quit both of those because they weren't teaching cartooning. And I wanted to be some kind of cartoonist, not a fine artist.
Is that the School of Visual Arts?
No, this was, I didn't know anything about the schools in New York. I'm from Tampa.
Oh, that's true.
we thought of New York as a place where you go and get mugged and killed. I didn't know anything. So I ended up going to the Art Institute of Fort Lauderdale, which was an awful school. And Auburn, Alabama, because my sister went there. Hey, Pat.
Hey.
Pat Broderick. So,
Just mentioned your name.
So when I went up to Neil, he said, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "Anything that pays." And he said, "Well, you've got some potential as a letterer." And so he called up Marvel and got me a job in the production department doing lettering corrections. And I did that for about 6 months, I think, maybe, before I went up to continuity. And worked my way up from lettering corrections to art corrections, and then finally started getting some freelance work, which is when I went to continuity. And Larry Hama was there also. Russ Heath was there. Marshall Rogers, Jack Abel, so many good people. And like Bob was saying, you could just watch them work. You could watch Russ Heath ink this tank with a brush, and watch Neil. And Neil wasn't a teacher, like Bob said. He would just kind of tell you if he didn't like something. I think the only advice he ever gave me was to slow down. You know, take a little more care with each line. But that's how I got started.
I actually did, can I mention?
Sure, go ahead.
He was talking about the people who got me in at continuity. Actually, I always leave out that story, as I shouldn't, because it's important. Mike Kaluta, who I know everybody's famous for doing The Shadow, and he's a star series. But I had met him at some conventions in New York, just when he was a fan artist, and he did some fan work at the time. And you know, we grew to be not great friends, but I knew him at the conventions. So we would occasionally talk on the phone once in a while, and I told him that I like to show him my samples. This is the time he was just finishing up The Shadow for DC. And he said, yeah, come over to the studio. I like to see what you're doing. So I went over to Mike's studio, looking at it. He said, yeah, it's got some potential here. And he had just finished doing the last cover to the one to a Shadow issue he was doing. So he said, listen, I got to bring this up to DC. Would you like to come along with me? I said, sure. So I brought up, and I met Joe Orlando, who was as Bob pointed out, the art director at the time. And Mike said, you need some new inkers up here? And Joe said, nope. Very direct, nope. So you know, Mike says, come with me. I got another idea. So where does he take me? Continuity. He introduced me to Neil. And Neil, I had some samples. And surprisingly enough, some of the samples I had shown Neil was inking a Steranko shadow piece that he had published at the time. So I put a lot of inking samples were done on vellum, tracing paper. So we had to work over that.
Yeah.
And that's not easy. That wasn't easy to do. So Neil's looking at the samples. He says, that's some really good potential stuff here. He says, do me a favor. Do this one and this one and this one over again. Come back in about 2 or 3 weeks or sooner, whenever you get them done. I said, okay. So I did it. I brought them over to Neil, and Neil said, better. Still needs improvement here and there. No, again, he's gonna tell you.
Yeah.
And he said, but would you like to work up here and being a crusty bunker? And I said, anything to get in the door. So there it was.
I went to the Kubert School after I got out of the Army, Joe Kubert School. And it was funny, after I graduated, my first interview at Marvel was with Larry Hama, and he basically told me I needed to go home and practice for 8 hours a day before I could get a job. So shortly after that, I was hired by Hasbro as a toy designer, and I went to Hasbro for 2.5 years and designed the G.I. Joe figures, the action figures. And during my time there, I started sending in samples to Marvel and DC, and any small publisher. I worked for First Comics, a whole bunch of people, but I slowly started getting covers and little short stories and things to ink while I was there. And then while I was there, my buddy Bart Sears got hired. And so, again, towards the end of our stint there, he started doing more and more comics, so then I started inking him more and more. And eventually, I just quit and went freelance, and I still wasn't getting much work. You know, again, I was working for small publishers, getting a few things here and there. And I got an interview at Vertigo with Karen Berger, and so that was my first real gig at DC when I started. She gave me a couple of books to ink before that, and then I jumped on Shade the Changing Man, so I did that for a couple of years. So that was my first major thing, so it took me a little while to break in, but you know, and did toy design and other things, but that was basically, you know, how I got in. But I've always been a comic fan. Since I was 5 years old, I've always loved to draw and things like that. And after high school, I was in the Army, and before I went to art school, so a little sidetracked, but I got in there sooner or later.
Pat, the question was, how'd we get started?
I don't think it's started.
Well, that's a little.
It's on.
Project.
Yeah, project.
There is a little handheld.
I'm not sure how much Bob shared with you about when he had broken in.
I told him about you going to the apprenticeship program and how we met up there in the convention.
Okay. There you go.
Ditto.
I had after that part of joining DC, I worked on staff for about 10 months to almost a year, almost survived a year there. And then I went over to continuity and picked up work with the Clutzy Bunkers also. And
Try one of these ones. It's got a microphone.
Work.
I don't know.
Is that Beachhead? You, with the green mask.
Oh,
Beachhead?
hey, bring that up. Thank you. There you go.
Yeah, it's taped down.
Yeah. Oh, darn it.
Bring you closer.
Should have an on switch up at the top.
Thank you, Bob.
Oh, there.
All right, better? Yeah, I do have a low, deep voice. And
Should've been
the
on
Florida
radio.
sunshine is still running off my head, which I did try to replenish, because we just ran it, we never on it. Okay. No, I was fortunate enough to basically be at the right time, the right place to enter the contest that DC had sponsored. Ran into this guy down in the lobby who claimed that he knew me, and after a few comments about the high school that we went together at, then I realized he was telling the truth, but he was a senior and I was a sophomore, I think, when he got in, 'cause believe it or not, he is older than me.
I didn't even mention, we were in the same high school art class in Tampa and didn't know each other in the
Yeah.
class, but we knew, I had seen him there.
Yeah, and, you know, public education, our classes aren't, you know, like all that they really need to be, could be, okay? But they are what they are. Then, after running into Bob and surprisingly being fortunate enough to have spotted Carmine Infantino and Salt Harris in a ballroom on the sign in the middle of the portfolio reviews. Out of about 2,000 people, I was the one brave enough to walk over and talk to them directly. Saul Harrison jumped my crap, told me I was breaking rules, I needed to go back to the line, but a taller man with a big long cigar in his mouth said, Saul, let the kid show us what he's got. So I laid out my portfolio on the floor in front of them. They looked at it, and Carmine handed me his card, told me to get back in the line, and when I get through, to talk to Joe Orlando. And at that time, when I walked in, Joe said he had already been told about me and that I was one of the selected winners. So I went back to my room elated, and the rest is tragic history from that point on. Okay. I'm curious, you worked at Hasbro?
Yep.
Okay. What, if you don't mind, what was the pay like while you were working? Was it good pay?
Let's
Was
see,
it
I,
comparable to comics?
It was a shame what the pay was. I started there in 1985 at $28,500 was my salary.
Okay, in 85,
1985, yeah.
okay, and benefits.
Yes, full benefits.
And you thought that was bad in 85.
Well, compared to what some of the other designers were getting,
Yeah, so there was
that
future there.
graduated from RISD and
Yeah.
prestigious art schools and stuff like that, yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Because they were making $60,000 and $70,000 a year, you know, and I was,
Got in the wrong profession.
yep. And because I went to the Cuban school and didn't have a degree,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
so other guys got, you know, commanded higher salaries and things like that.
My first year in the business, I made $3,000.
Yeah,
Oh, no, well, my first year in the comic business, I made, I think, 13,000.
Yeah.
Look, my first year.
yeah, so I was also an educator between then and now, and I would have students ask me, you know, why did I leave comics? I told them I didn't leave, comics left me. And that the greatest thing I could share with them was you have to be able to adapt in a changing environment. Hence, I was in education. Prior to that, I was in advertising. But I told them, I said, if you've got this bug to draw comics, I consider it a
toilet.
Yeah.
Pretty much.
And if you're not
Take
drawing,
one day
you
off.
feel bad if, you know, it's like something's nagging you that you should be doing. And that's the way it's been, you know. I'm still very active today, you know. Doing work for, First Comics, working on a game through them, they're pitching for a, multiplayer game, so I'm doing designs for that. I'm doing, I think it's the 6th issue, or they're collecting it as a trade, or both, I'm not sure, but I'm finishing the 1st issue now. I just finished some work for, Zenoscope Comics, which, calm down, it's not the good girl side. They actually picked up, the licensing for the Ripley's, believe it or not, so.
That's
I worked it
fantastic.
now, and had fun doing a couple stories, one historical and the other, more, what if type story, you know, if like tomorrow Yellowstone erupts. So, but I've always liked doing a variety of things other than these silly guys in spandex costumes running around, you know. It's truly not my preference, you know, to draw at this stage of my
We
life.
also grew up with the Gold Key comics, so we got to
Oh,
read
yeah.
the Three
Yeah.
Musketeers.
Yeah. Well, and Bob
you know,
loved
Moby
Mad
Dick, all
Magazine,
kinds
Mark
of great
Drucker's
comics
work,
that
yeah.
were available to us besides Batman and
Yeah.
Superman. I mean, I love those books. I love
Oh,
getting
Russ
the Robin.
Manning's run on anything that
Yeah.
was pretty back then, yeah.
I like the
Yes.
Harvey comics, the old Richie Rich and Wendy the Good Little Witch and all that stuff.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so maybe we had a better variety and far more publishers than today. But I enjoy superhero, but I also enjoy the darker side of things, but also humor. You know, my Firestorm series, Jerry and I always try to work humor into the story wherever we could. Sometimes I surprised him because we did vocal plotting over the phone, and I was to take notes, and those notes expanded in the process. So there were things I was able to throw in that he was surprised about. And that's about it. I don't want to take over.
That's all right.
Okay.
Any other questions at all? Yes.
Of all the different arcs or characters that you work on, has there been one that just emotionally meant a great deal to you? And if so, why? Because you had a connection with that piece.
Can I start with it?
Yeah, sure.
The main comic book I read as a kid, I was much more into humor. I was reading Mad Magazine, but the comic I read was Superman, all of the Superman comics, the Superman family, Crypto and Supergirl and all of those stuff. And I would buy those. My sister would buy Archie comics, and we'd swap them and read them both. But mainly I read Superman. So when I got to draw Superman for Action Comics in my job, it was a big thrill for me, and that's probably the one that I was most excited about, even though I'm better known for the New Mutants.
Want me to take it?
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Yesterday, somebody had asked me this, asked the other two artists that were here the same question. And when I started reading comics, it was before Marvel was Marvel. It was the Tales of Suspense, where they had monster and sci-fi stories and horror stories and everything you could think of. And I would occasionally read some DC stuff at the time, but I wasn't really into Superman. I kind of liked Batman because of his mysterious detective side. Even though I like Superman, it wasn't really something I would have inclined to have read back then. But I liked the offbeat characters that DC had, which were Rip Hunter, Time Master, The Challengers of the Unknown, Doom Patrol. Every of these offbeat that were shows sort of out of the regular DC universe. But then again, one year in 1961, when I was 8 years old, all of a sudden I see Fantastic Four #1 on the stands, thinking it was a monster comic because it kind of has this monster coming out of you think it is. It's not. It was something totally different. And from then on, I was hooked as far as the Marvel universe. Then Spider-Man came out, and that was even better. So.
For me, Tarzan has always been the alpha and the omega. That's what I grew up as a kid, and then when Kubert's Tarzan came out in '72, I was just in love. And then I started reading the books and things like that. But I've never really gotten to work on Tarzan. But Martin Powell's writing a new Tarzan. novel, and he asked me to illustrate it, so I get to do some spot illustrations for that, so I'm pretty excited about that.
I'm jealous.
The pretense of your question is, are the characters at work that we are emotionally attached to? Not a good time to ask me that question. I posted a comment on Facebook. I'm gonna try to dance around this as lightly as possible, but we also focus our pain into our art. Okay? I lost a son 7 months back. All right, so art's been my therapy. I've been focusing it that way. That's all I gotta say. Like I said, this is a terrible time to ask me that question, but you didn't know that. I can't get it out of my head right now. So right now, yeah, I focus the pain into the art, sort of channel it that way.
I don't know where our moderator is, but.
Any other questions?
Take questions.
Good.
What would you say is your favorite drawing from when you were like little? Like if you draw just like what's your favorite sketch or drawing you've ever done?
I'll take that again.
Should I go first or we'll go down the line?
Yeah.
Yeah,
When I was in high school, I did a still life. Everyone else was doing flowers and stuff. Well, I found an old phone that you dial like this, and one of the big black ones with the chain, with the change comes out at the bottom, and you hang it up. So I took this old phone, and I had a skeleton hand. I put the skeleton hand dial in it, and I called it Death Caller. And so this painting I did was probably 10th grade. So that's probably my favorite thing I did as a kid.
When I was in 3rd grade, I did a drawing of Woody Woodpecker on my school portfolio cover. And everyone in the class got all excited and wanted me to draw one on their folders. So I ended up tracing over that onto the whole class's folders. Kind of started my being known as an artist in school.
Let's see. I remember creating this character, as they were answering giving you their answers. It was a character I was trying to think of a character, and I just liked the Human Torch at the time, so I was very, very young, and I called him Darkfire. And I remember drawing this sort of character instead of flame, it was a black flame, and I just drawing for the heck of it. And I remember actually sending it to Marvel, doing a drawing. I was just sent it out to Marvel. I got it, and I did get a response saying, it's just an amateur drawing, but they're just trying to be nice. They said, "Very nice drawing, Robert," and was sent Stan in the game. Of course, I'm quite sure, I don't know if Stan actually signed the card, because Flo Steinberg, who worked up there, she did a lot of the signing. I mean, maybe Stan would write his name, and then, Flo would do the rest, but, yeah.
For me, it's not necessarily a character that I created myself, but it was Steve Ditko. Almost every school paper I worked on from the 3rd grade through junior high school had a Spider-Man drawing on the back of it. I mean, seriously, it did. My history could be just flipped over and you could see it. And I never had a really drive or desire to draw a specific character until I got actually into the industry, at that point.
Anyone else?
What is your, what do you see significant changes in storytelling now in comic books to maybe when you started? Is there anything significant, or the way that people approach a story in comic books now than when you started out?
Yeah, when I started out, most of the people in the business were older. They were in their 40s, 50s, and had been a little more trained as artists for comics. The editors were also artists, a lot of them. Today, a lot of the illustration market has died off and been replaced by photography, and people playing around in Photoshop with photography. And so a lot of those illustrators that were getting a lot of work in the illustration market have drifted into the comic business, and they can draw really well, they do wonderful illustrations, but they haven't learned storytelling. So a lot of the storytelling you're seeing in comics today is people standing and posing rather than the best way to tell a story. You know, should you have a long shot or a close-up or whatever. And also the rise of the original art market when Image Comics came along, that kind of coincided with when original art started being worth more money. And the Image guys realized, hey, if I draw this original page with like pinup style with the big characters in costume and everything, I can sell that original for more money than if I'm just doing a lot of backgrounds and stuff.
And that was also the end of making deadlines. When I first broke in, you had to make deadlines. And then shortly after that, it was like folks were coming out on time. It was, I don't know. I mean, you guys agree with that?
Yeah, totally changed, yeah.
I mean, you had to make deadlines, you know. DC was 3 months ahead.
What was
You
your
didn't make
longest
your
run
deadline.
on the series,
Probably 2.5 years.
Yeah,
Bob?
that's about 2.5 years, I think the long.
Same with me. I just kept jumping off because I wanted to eat my own work.
Well, yeah. No, it was the same with me. It was about 2.5, close to 3. Couldn't seem to get past that hurdle, that 30-year hurdle. Find a creative team that's on a series 3 years now. You know, unless it's independently published, if it's one of the majors.
Most of them are 3 months now.
Yeah.
Three issues. Yeah.
And then you might have 3 artists on it.
I think
Yeah.
Eric Larson.
Yeah. Well, there's been a big change. I mean, a lot of us really, truly depend on conventions to supplement our income, or it might be the majority of the earned income for us today. And then since that kind of replaced, in a sense, the royalty payments, I could be jaded about this, but I think when they started paying the royalty checks and the artists started getting really nice checks, they didn't work until they needed money again. You know, well, yeah. I mean, my incentive was I was married, I had 4 boys, and house payments. I mean, our incentive is we're family men, so you know, you get a check in, and it's great. You put it in the bank, so you know you don't need it, but you keep working. You know, but it didn't seem to continue on. But like I said, my opinion is jaded. So.
I was just trying to point out before, Eric Larson has done like over 100 issues of his character Savage Dragon. So that speaks well for him. And again, but he's independent. So I don't think I've seen quite that many issues since Jack Kirby did the Fantastic Four, doing over 100 issues of the title at Marvel. Have you?
No, I was thinking Gene Colan, Wolfman,
Oh,
Mark
yeah.
Wolfman on Dracula,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
you know,
That's
it's-
a good close one. Yes,
Yeah.
definitely.
yeah.
Specifically for Bob L, when it came to New Mutants, I grew up with the New Mutants, and I know that you second half of that team, and I love it. I love that there's some humor to it. Your art style was fantastic. Cannonball big ears, and I can be, looking at all day. I love all that stuff. But when Liefeld came into it, and it became a much darker area for becoming X-Force, especially since you're like into the more cartoonish, light artist side, how did you feel about those characters transition into a darker, grittier team?
So if everybody didn't hear that, his question was, when I started out on the New Mutants, I was injecting humor into the characters the way I drew them, and later on when Rob Liefeld came on, it got much darker and changed the characters. So when I created those characters, I'm from a more Drucker, Mad Magazine background, and I like drawing individual characters rather than just stereotypical figures where everybody kind of looks the same but has different hair color or something. So I tried to make each of the New Mutants have a different body type and a different just structure, basically make them little individuals. And because of my humor background, I enjoyed doing stuff like giving Cannonball big ears and you know, various things. So when I left the book, and the main reason I left the book was just deadlines. I wasn't happy not inking my own work, and I didn't like the way the work looked, so I just left. I didn't want to see what the other artists were doing with the characters, because I knew they'd be, like right away, Sal Buscema took over after me. And Sal was probably drawing 3 books a month, and it was just a paycheck to him. He didn't have any emotional connection to the characters. So his style was just much more, and I'm not criticizing Sal because he's a great artist, but his work on that was just much more medium shots, putting them in there, stereotypical hand poses and everything. And like I would always try to do something interesting with my fingers on my hands when I was drawing them. But you can't draw very quickly when you're doing all that. So I was slow. And after I left, I didn't want to know because I knew they would change them. And I've since seen many series of the New Mutants where suddenly Roberto is as tall as Sam Guthrie, and he's supposed to be like my height, 5'6", 5'7", and Sam's supposed to be 6 feet. You know, they just start making them much more stereotypical and losing all of the individuality I tried to put into them, so I don't want to know about it. I didn't read any of the issues really after I left. Even Bill Sienkiewicz, I like Bill's work a lot. Hugely different than what I was doing with him. I'm a fan of Bill's work, but I didn't read his comics. Any more questions?
Anybody?
Going once.
I'm sorry.
Speak up a little bit, by the way.
I'm a comic writer, new comic writer, working for an indie company like that, and I'm going to be working with my first artist collaboration, especially like over the phone through Skype and that kind of thing. So as artists, like what is it that you look for from your writer to help, you know, with the storytelling in the comic? Like what is it that you guys really need from the writer when you're doing your work?
You want to start?
Sure. The format that you might choose to structure your writing in, okay? I prefer, myself, movie script format, okay? The plain description of the scene, the characters, the motivations, and what they're doing. Dialogue, and just move on, and I've worked with a variety of really, really good writers, and like Doug Munch's plots would be 40 pages long for a 20-page book, you know, whereas like Bill Manlow's plots would be maybe 3 pages for a 20-page book. So it depends on the comfort level that you create with your artist, okay? Have you decided whether you're gonna write full script or plot?
Full script.
Okay. Well, enjoy it. I mean, just like I said, for myself, my own preference is movie script format, so.
I always liked to plot rather than a finished script because to me, a lot of the writers I worked with were good at dialogue, were good at plotting and ideas, but they weren't that good at visualizing what they were writing. So they would end up having pages that weren't visually interesting the way they wrote them. People would be standing around, sitting around. And in comics, especially superhero comics, you want to have action. You want to have people doing things. So I would always come up with an excuse to have the characters moving, flying, using their powers, just not standing there talking. And so when I was working from a plot, I had much more leeway to do that. Whereas when I'm working from a finished script, depending on some writers are very finished, right down to the dialogue they're saying, others are looser. Chris Claremont would give me really way too much plot to put into a comic, it wouldn't fit. And so I'd have to edit it down to make it fit into the number of pages. And Chris was fine with that. He said he'd rather give me more than not enough. But I would have to edit it down. So what I'd prefer from a writer is something that fits in the issue. and so that I don't have to also be an editor. And movement, you know, have the characters doing things instead of just talking. I mean, I know it's a lot of fun as a writer to have your characters talking rather than you just have the artist do all of the fun stuff and you're just giving him a story. But try to give the artist something that's going to be interesting in a visual way instead of just a story way.
I don't have a whole lot of experience penciling ink, and I've only pencil inked a couple books. But I like what Pat likes is full description of what's going on with the word balloons. You know, they're already there and everything. But I also don't mind a little side note, like if there's a room layout, you know, telling me where all the windows and stuff are, you know, or I don't mind if the writer puts a little sketch and says this guy's head should be here, this guy's head should be here. You know, I kind of like a little visual reference when they're writing also. It just helps to get it across a little bit better for me. But like I said, I don't have a whole lot of experience with pencil and inking, you know, scripts and stuff like that. Just a few books I pencil. Mostly I've inked, so.
Well, same with myself. I very little experience. The only experience I had with working penciling and inking, well, actually just penciling and inking penciling inking one story, a very short story for what the Marvel's humor magazine, and penciling only penciling another story was, and I went up to Carl Potts and said I could do something. Can I do something for the humor book? And he said, well, would you like to pencil something? I said, sure. He goes, and Stan's going to write it. I said, sure, I'll take that anytime. So I got this script from, everything was there that Stan wanted, and I just kind of elaborated. Carl went over, this is one of the first things I kind of penciled at the time. So he showed me how to make it a little bit more dramatic, so he changed a few things, and he was right. So I changed it around, and Stan seemed to like it. So they did a sequel, The Origin of the Silver Burger. So I penciled, which that was a lot of fun. Now that one, I was looking at specifically at the Mad Comics, not the Mad Magazine, but the Mad Comics in the 50s. So I did it in that format. Now I didn't have time to ink it. Now this was the most interesting thing is that. And I said, listen, I said, listen, you have to get this in. I said, I don't have time to ink because I'm doing something else. So Carl said, okay. He got John Severin to ink it. And if anybody knows who John Severin is, another phenomenal artist that did great stories for DC, doing a lot of great war stories. I mean, if you want to put Russ, Joe Kubert, you have to add John Severin as far as doing World War II and war stories. Phenomenal artist, and he can really do anything. He can do humor, he can do superheroes, he can do anything. But again, when he inked my story, it made it look even more like a Mad comic, which made it even better. But again, it was interesting because again, Stan's stories, everything was there, nothing to nothing to change or anything. Everything was self-explanatory. I added one little piece of dialogue, and Stan didn't care, where Silver Burger actually goes after Galacticus. I forget what he called it. He gave him a strange name. So he burps at Galactus. Galactus falls. And so all of a sudden, and he's getting up. I saw the draw panel, and Galactus is tired. He's getting up. He says, so I had a little blurb saying, I'm getting too old for this. I just figured I'd throw in something on. And Carl said, no, fine, it's fine. Don't worry about it.
I don't know about the rest of the guys, but Mad Magazine had a huge influence on me, just like Marvel and DC did. I mean, to me, that was just as important as reading all the superhero stuff. It was, I guess it was your aid because they parodied everything. And like I said, it was a huge influence, just as big as Marvel and DC.
Yeah, I wanted to be more Drucker basically, and work for Mad Magazine. I ended up never even applying for Mad Magazine because I figured I was too much like Mort Drucker, and there have since been many other artists, Drucker imitators, but I didn't want to just be a Drucker imitator, and I didn't know where else to go with that kind of style because I admired his style so much. But Mad Magazine, when we were little, it was much more, from what I've seen of it lately, it was much more intellectual humor, more political. It really kind of helped me form my political opinions, reading Mad Magazine. It's a little more, it appealed to all ages, but there was definitely stuff that an adult, an older reader could really enjoy with it, as well as the simple humor that the kids would enjoy as well.
My mother wouldn't let me buy it till I was 12, though. I was around that magazine. Because there'd always be a little naked girl running across the top of the borders. And we don't know who does those. so.
Sergio Aragonés.
And of course, Sergio Aragonés did such great work for that magazine, The Mad Look at Anything. He even had The Mad Look at Batman, which was interesting to see Sergio Aragonés drawing Batman. That was so, you know, we're all used to all the artists drawing Batman. Here's Sergio Aragonés doing it. Bizarre, but it was great.
So at other panels like this, people have asked us how the business has changed. When we got started, you could hang out in the Marvel office all day if you wanted, and that's how I got a lot of my early jobs, was just
Work
being
there.
there. And the job would come in, and I said, you know, I'll take that, and you'd get work that way. It was a very friendly place. We had a Marvel softball team, and Stan came and pitched at a couple of the softball games. We had a volleyball team, played against other publishing houses, and it was just a fun place to work, whereas now it's so corporate and cold. You make an appointment to go in, you see your editor, and then you gotta leave. It's just a totally different
You
business.
could hang out with production guys. There were open desks. If you weren't finished, you could go in and fix a few things, or whatever. It was great.
And if you had to do a job, like a lot of times I'd be going up there and doing last minute jobs up there at Marvel themselves. And strangely enough, I was working one day and I was just outside one of the editor's office. There was a table right there, just the only table, it was separate from the bullpen. And this is not the later office, but anyway. I'm working on a job, retelling the origin of Spider-Man, inking it up. And who comes in that day? Steve Ditko. And I had met him before, so he kind of recognized me. So he came over to me, started talking. He's looking at the work that I'm doing. He says, "Yeah, this guy's penciled," because you could tell that the penciler had swiped a couple of his panels. So I'm kind of inking it like Ditko. And he says, "I'm trying to do this." And he's looking at it. He said, "Oh, very nice." I go, "Oh, they're retelling it again." I said, "Yeah, aren't they always retelling it, Mr. Ditko?" He goes, "Oh, Steve." I go, "Okay, aren't they always retelling it, Steve?" He goes, "Yeah, they are." Yep. So he was very nice about it. Like you're kind of getting a little apprehensive considering how the animosity he had about the character for a while. But no, he was nice. He was very nice. But that was one of the things like that would happen. You go up there and all of a sudden you see this artist you had, then you get a compliment from an artist, like you admire his work and he's complimenting you. And that happened with Sal Buscema. I never met Sal Buscema and was introduced to him and we're talking. He goes, "Oh, you're Bob Wiacek." I goes, yeah. And I'm telling you how much I love his work. "Oh, Bob, I really like your work." And he said, "Wait a minute." I said, Sal, wait, there's something wrong here. You don't compliment me, I compliment you. That's,
Yeah. Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah.
Seeing your best careers, is there a character, a stylish character that you haven't worked with that you would like to work with?
I always wanted to draw Batman, and never really got the chance, except as a guest star in one of the Superman issues I drew. So I would have liked to have had a shot at Batman. I inked him over Graham Nolan, but I would rather have tried penciling him.
Well, like I said, I was talking about Tarzan, and I get to work on him next year, so I'm good to go.
Yeah. Okay.
That's good.
No, I mean, I worked on all the characters that I really wanted to work on. I got to work on Swamp Thing. Firestorm was fun. Weird World characters. I'm very happy with what I worked on. I can't say there was a book that I was really dying to do that I didn't get a chance to do.
I'd have to say The Shadow. Loved it. Always loved the character, as I said yesterday on the panel, and would love to have done it. Either story, working on it, either penciling, or even just inking the particular pencil on it. So I like to say that.
I would also have liked to have done a Western. Never got a chance to draw a Western comic. I would like to have drawn a romance comic. When I started, there was all these different genres. There were kung fu comics, there were monster comics, and science fiction comics, and Westerns, and romance, and superheroes. And it all kind of started going way more towards superheroes over the course of my career. So I would love to have drawn some other genres.
Western would have been fun.
Yeah. Yeah, Jose Luis Garcia Lopez, has everybody heard of him here? Yeah, he's one of the, I think, one of my favorite Western artists. I mean, he's a phenomenal draftsman as well, but still, he does Westerns like the many artists that have done, but he does them so well.
What were you gonna say, Mark?
I was a big Crumb fan too. I like the Fabulous Furry Freak Brothers and all that stuff too in the 70s.
Underground.
I read all that underground comics. Yeah. And then Corbin put out a lot of stuff in those
Yeah.
in those head shops and things like that. That's where you could really, before heavy metal, that's really where you could only get Richard Corbin's work is in the old hippie shops and stuff like that.
Corbin did a parody on Magnus the Robot Fighter,
Yeah.
calling Mangle the Robot Bangler.
Yeah, and
it
then
was
one of the first
interesting.
things I seen of Corbin's was Boy and His Dog, where they later made the
Right.
Don Johnson movie, and Richard Corbin illustrated that. Oh, that was cool stuff.
Thank you.
I'm sorry.
That's all right.
I have a more technical question that I've noticed in comic books as of late, like especially Marvel. I see a lot less panels and a lot more, splash pages and things like that. To the point where actually on like Tom King's Batman, like they've instituted like some 9-panel, things, as a revolutionary, of storytelling in a way. And it's that noticeable now that there's just so few panels. And I feel in my personal opinion that takes away from the story because less panels means less storytelling. I don't know if you guys have kept up with the industry as far as I'm concerned, but if you have, like, what is your take on that?
That goes back to what I was saying about the originals being worth more if they've got big shots of the characters on them. That's all that is. So the artists aren't doing their job, basically. They're trying to make money instead of telling a story in a comic book, which is what should be their job. But I don't, it's hard to argue with the fact that they're making a lot of money.
Plus, I think one thing that kind of happened is pages got small. Guys used to work fairly big, and then when you start shrinking the pages, now you got guys working 8.5 by 11. I don't know. I can't.
We used to
can't
draw
work
them
that
twice
small.
up.
Yeah, I can't work that, so I don't like doing those small pages. A lot of people do now, so I think that may have a little something to do with it. I could much rather have a large page where I could.
Well, see, they could work any size they want, really.
Well,
And
no,
then-
because scanners are only 11 by 17 now.
Well,
Everything has to be
No, but
scanned.
you can put it through a scanner and it puts it together. You can have it or put it in anybody who's into computers more than I am. I'm not a computer expert by no stretch. You can scan it in sections
Yeah,
and
you
it
can
comes
put it
together.
together.
But
Yeah,
and
that's
then-
true.
But then again, so they can really work in any size, but they prefer that size because maybe
Well,
of
it's
what just Bob said.
Faster and easier, and also a lot of them are working on graphic tablets now, they're not even working on paper.
Yeah.
So that would tend to make it a little more, you're focused on these single images instead of seeing the page as a whole.
But I saw Bill Sienkiewicz painting something the other day, and I was laughing my butt off. I'm like, holy smoke, he had a screen this big. He was painting with his fingers and picking up tools and all this stuff, so I was like, yeah, if you don't have a little screen, that'd be great, but I have a tiny screen. I don't have one that big.
My own input on this is, I hate the fact that you might have 3 pages of stories and then 3 pages of ads and 3 pages of stories. It's like the worst of commercial TV suddenly. And I've been locked into a comic book where the writer only wanted to do 9-panel grids for every issue, and that's not a good way for an artist to be locked in. I'll tell you that right now. I hated it. And I recently just did a 9-panel page and found myself going back into the nightmare working on Ragman and doing 9-panel pages again. And I'm working from a plot, but there was a lot of information that Peter wanted, so it required 9 panels. So I didn't mind doing it. I do a lot of my work pasting the story on the peak points of the scenes that the writer has written, and I like the fact that the writers might structure it their own writing, say in Shakespearean three-act formats, okay? Because we're still dealing with 22 pages, But I've recently made comments on social media about the lack of seen a lot of books since then, and some are better than what I had seen earlier, but still there seems to be an overall lack of understanding that the reader is supposed to lose touch of reality when they're reading these comics. It's supposed to become completely submerged into these stories like you will with a movie. And if that's not happening, then the artist, not the writer, the artist is not doing his job. I mean, it falls on the artist back. So that's the way I feel about it.
Yeah, I was working for the Swedish publisher Egmont doing the Phantom for a couple of years, and their policy was they wanted an average of 7 panels per page. And when you've got helicopters and boats and jeeps and all these vehicles, and you got all these guns, and they had several characters in a lot of the scenes, it's really hard to make an interesting page when you've got to do 7 panels, because there's no room for one big shot, like a money shot, you know, where it's fun to look at. It's so focused on the storytelling. I got really tired of that after a couple years. It was just too much information going into too few big panels, with a lot of little panels. So it's not, I think 5 panels a page is a good average.
Yeah, what I've noticed with Marvel especially, I'm not trying to knock Marvel by any means, but with Marvel especially, like they'll do, 3 panels, 2 panels, a splash page, then 4 panels, then 2 panels, and I just feel like you're taking a story that should be, maybe an arc of 3 comic books, and you're stretching it out to 6 comic books, and, like I find that I get lost in that, whereas like I've noticed that like DC at least tries, it seems like they try to keep their writers and artists in at least 4 to 5 panel, thing with than your splash page and stuff like that. And I think it gives the splash page much more interest when you've been doing, like 4 to 5 panels on a page, and then you do a splash page, Like it makes it more interesting than I've already seen 3 splash pages before this, so.
Go up to the artists that are doing the 3 panel pages and tell them that.
No. Straight down the line.
Actually, I'm curious if these might be decisions that are also being affected by deadline problems. They have to get that book out.
Do they even give them deadlines anymore?
I don't really know about.
They actually care if they get deadlines?
Yeah.
Well, the last deadline job I worked on for DC Comics, even though I had, they had given me 30 days to produce 16 pages, pencil and ink, as soon as the script was approved. They kept sending the script back for rewrites, but did not extend my deadline. So my 30 days got cut down to 2 weeks eventually, and told me to make the deadline, which I said, I'll make that 30-day deadline, boss, no problem. Because it's the way the business can be. I did turn the job around in probably about 18 to maybe 20 days and got it in, but it was still late, But I'm not one of these guys that, okay, throw everything out and just throw in 3 panels, because I can't do that.
Also, if you've noticed, the style has changed, where we used to have really simple costumes. Jack Kirby and John Buscema, Dave Cockrum, they made these costumes that you could draw on a tiny little panel and it looked fine. But now they've got all these buckles and these pouches and little doodads and little details that are very hard to draw in a panel this big. So that's another reason they're doing bigger panels. Costumes have gotten ridiculously complicated.
And in the last 2 years, I've been called by Valiant and asked to do finishes on 5 pages in 24 hours. So that's the kind of stuff, that makes you just want to stop doing comics. And what time was this supposed to go?
I have no idea. I was
I guess
a late
we're done.
comer, guys.
Anybody, any
One
more
last
questions?
question? Anybody in the back?
Kind of related to the last 2 questions that he asked, how much say, because things are always changing in certain publications, like Apple Comics, like, certainly 5 panels or more or less, how much say do you guys have as artists to either add your own, like, nuance and flair to these, like, big established characters, and also how much say, if any, in, like, storyboarding and,
with you too. There's a lot of politics that do play in this industry, and it depends on the relationships that are in play. I had made a slight variation in a action scene where a character was supposed to jump on top of a table and slip and fall off the table and then get killed. And I had him jump on top of the table, and the inertia pushed the table over, and he fell and he got killed. I didn't think it was any big deal. The writer had me fired. Okay, so I was happy to be fired. All right, but because it showed me what kind of relationship I was like walking into after leaving, like almost 2 years. It was a really good relationship. That was a learning experience that for me, if you start with a writer on a new series and then the writer decides, say, a year or a year and a half down the road that he's going to move on, that's a good time to move on to, because you never know what's going to happen. And it leaves you with a false sense of security since you're the older person on the book. You know? So that happened to me on Doom 2099, which is why I was moved off that series. So, you know, you have to gauge these things just like in life. You know, some guy might just call up from Britain and throw a fit, and next thing you know, you're not getting a script from the editor when you finish the last one. So.
Actually, not concerning with me. Paul Smith, when he was just getting into the industry, and I remember Paul telling myself and a few other people about this particular story he was doing with Chris Claremont to end he was doing the final chapter of this story that had been started by Michael Golden. One chapter was done by Dave, and the final chapter was Paul. So there's one scene where Kazar is coming up to Angel in the Savage Land, and he, in the original script, Chris had written in, he was carrying a dead deer around his neck, you know, for food. So Paul said, you know, in the Savage Land, I think he'd be carrying a dinosaur, more of a dead, you know, small little dinosaur for, you know, to cut up and have for dinner. So Chris said, that's fine, go with it. So there's a positive side where Chris, you know, said, that makes sense, that's fine. Go right ahead. So there you go. I think that's what started with, because he had done that story before. He had done the X-Men, so that kind of like, so sort of semi-solidified in the beginning that their relationship will be pretty good once they do that book.
So up until Image Comics, you pretty much had to draw the characters the way they had been drawn. They expected Captain America to look the same way he had been looking. Every time I would draw Peter Parker, John Romita, the art director, would change my Peter Parker faces to look more like John Romita's Peter Parker.
Style guides.
House styles.
And then Todd McFarlane came in and couldn't draw Peter Parker to look like Peter Parker. So I think John Romita just threw up his hands. And from that point on, they started giving artists much more leeway into how they wanted to draw each particular character. But I think Todd was the start of that. Yeah, go ahead. Did you have a question?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, but yeah, I have more of a meat and potatoes question. How difficult is it to get into y'all's industry, particularly if you're a pen and paper artist, not necessarily on the computer?
It's impossible. Don't even bother. It's really competitive. We used to just compete with people around New York. You had to live in New York to get work. Now it's worldwide, and you can't even submit your work to Marvel anymore because they have so many people submitting work to them. They don't have time to look at them. So they have to find you. So you have to kind of put yourself out there online, or work for smaller publishers, or self-publish. And if they see something they like, they'll come to you and say, would you like to draw Spider-Man this month or whatever. But it's crazy hard to get in the business now.
You might get lucky and meet an editor at a convention or something.
Yes.
And if you can show them your work, if you get lucky, you know, that might get you something. But like he said, there's no mailing samples in anymore. There's no going to see editors anymore. Do they?
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, go to the slightly smaller publishers.
Yeah.
Slightly smaller publishers better, yeah.
But you can work on paper. There's no stigma about still drawing on paper. thank goodness.
Yeah, you can
No, no,
scan
not
the
at
work
all.
in, so that's the thing about, you can scan the work in, so that's,
Yeah, he's won several online contests, pen and
Let's,
paper.
from what I hear, webtoons is kind of cool to start off. You have an idea, or if you're working with a writer or something, and that may get you a little notice or something, because it's a free website, and people subscribe to it, and you get paid if you can get a webtoon, so,
Yeah, he wants to write and do the art.
yeah.
Well, the good thing is there's hundreds of publishers now that are publishing comics, and somebody's got to draw those comics. So in that sense, there's more opportunity. You just have to work for those smaller publishers.
Plus, there's a big independent market going on right now where people are just publishing themselves. And,
Yeah.
you know, you can get print on demand. You can,
I
you know,
mean, he's not looking at that stuff.
yeah.
Yeah.
But like I said, there's a big movement going on right now with independent people.
So maybe that's what we didn't have to become a consultant.
Well, you might have to do that too. Because I've done everything.
Yeah.
We keep going.
I used to be a stock boy. We got to end this panel.
Yes.
We got to get back to our tables. So if you want to ask us more questions, we all are downstairs at the.
One quick question, do you guys have a favorite artist that you've seen here that's at the show?
Bob,
With each other, like
both of them.
amateurs or
I haven't even looked
I
around.
knew you were
I don't
talking about
know.
McLeod. Well, actually, one of the old, well, say old timers that came before even myself and everybody here was Joe Giella. He's up there. He inks just about everybody in the business. So if you want to go up and, you know, say hello to him, and if you have a book for him to sign, by all means, at least go up and say hello in the artist alley. And Steve Root, because Steve Root's going to be doing a panel tomorrow. But yeah, another phenomenal talent and storyteller.
Yeah, I'm pretty much at my table, so I don't even know who all's at the convention.
I don't know, but artists I'm kind of following is Sean Murphy. I really like his stuff. When
Very
he did
good,
The
yeah.
Wake, and you know, he's got a little eclectic style, little anime stuff going on, a little Jorge Safino stuff going on, some Japanese. So I kind of like his work right now. He seems to be doing some really cool stuff.
Sergio Cariello,
Yes.
very good artist.
Definitely.
We got to get going, guys.
Thank you.